fundamentals of existence. The same thing that makes you is the same thing that makes up everything else. If you can
imagine a world in which the vast majority of people. Much later, in the 20th century, Daedalus, a master craftsman and architect of the labyrinth of Crete, once created wings made from feathers and wax that would help him and his son Icarus escape their imprisonment. Before they attempted to escape, Daedalus warned Icarus against flying too close to the sun or the sea, as the sea's dampness would clog his wings and the sun's heat would melt them. But Icarus ignored his father's caution and flew higher toward the sun. As he came closer, the heat melted the wax that kept his wings together. Unable to maintain his wings as the feathers came loose, Icarus began to fall and plunged into the sea below and perished. Hence the Icarian Sea got its name. There are different reasons and interpretations of why Icarus decided to fly so close to the sun. Some say youthful impulsiveness made him feel invincible and prone to risk-taking. Others claim it was the allure of danger and the seeking of thrill. But could there be a darker, more disturbing reason behind his actions? Austrian neurologist and founder of psychoanalysis Sigmund Freud believed that humans are subject to two opposing drives. The first is the life drive, also known as eros. The second one is the death drive, later called thanatos. Although Freud admitted that the concept was speculative, the death drive became essential to his later theoretical framework. The death drive points to irrational, self-destructive tendencies within human behavior. It supposedly motivates us to repeat traumatic experiences, engage in conduct that leads to demise, or cause violence outwardly toward other beings. It also underlies an inexplicable desire for pain or an irrational tendency to undermine one's well-being. And at the root of all this, there's a longing to return to the inorganic state we all came from. Death. The death drive is undoubtedly one of the most confusing concepts I've delved into. There have been various interpretations and explanations of the death drive, reshaped and expanded by thinkers like Jacques Lacan and Slavoj Žižek. Even though I tried my best, I acknowledge that my exploration is limited, especially regarding later interpretations. However, my focus leans less on its psychoanalytical facets and more on the existential questions the death drive evokes. Why would living entities harbor a wish for self-destruction or even death? And if we look closer at the sufferings of existence, isn't longing to revert to an inorganic state quite understandable? This video explores self-destructive tendencies in the light of Freud's death drive and death itself. A little warning, this video isn't very cheerful, so if you're struggling mentally, consider not watching it. Also, the purpose of this video is simply to explore Freud's concept, and it's not intended to be helpful or anything like that. Thank you. In the wake of World War I, humanity faced unprecedented devastation. Amidst this backdrop, Sigmund Freud observed his young grandson playing a curious game. The boy would repeatedly throw a toy out of sight and say fort, German for gone, and then retrieve it and say da, German for there. What seemed to be simple, meaningless childplay, Freud saw as a profound but mysterious phenomenon. A human tendency to replicate and repeat undesirable, possibly traumatic events, such as loss. In the case of the boy, the game would have been triggered by the temporary absence of his mother, during which he played that game. Before the war, Freud developed an idea that he called the pleasure principle, Lustprinzip in German, which is the instinctive seeking of pleasure and avoiding pain. Though he had previously suggested that humans predominantly seek pleasure and avoid pain, his grandson's game showed another dimension to human motivation. This curious human drive became all too apparent for Freud, observing the intense trauma caused by the war, including his own, especially after losing his daughter. Freud observed how war veterans repeatedly relived traumatic battlefield experiences in their dreams. He also saw his patients continually find themselves in the same destructive relationships or situations again and again. Thus, he came to believe that humans harbor an intrinsic drive towards self-destruction and ultimately death. How else could we explain these irrational tendencies to self-harm and self-death that Humans, including his own, all too apparent dimension to seek and a pleasure principle, Lustprinzip in German, which is the instinctive seeking of pleasure and avoiding pain. Though he had previously suggested that humans predominantly seek pleasure and avoid pain, his grandson's game showed another dimension to human motivation. This curious human drive became all too apparent for Freud, observing the intense trauma caused by the war, including his own, especially after losing his daughter. Freud observed how war veterans repeatedly relived traumatic battlefield experiences in their dreams. He also saw his patients continually find themselves in the same destructive relationships or situations again and again. Thus, he came to believe that humans harbor an intrinsic drive towards self-destruction and, ultimately, death. How else could we explain these irrational tendencies to self-harm and self-annihilate? Before diving further into the death drive, let's look at what this phenomenon drives us toward: the inorganic state, the great nothingness, death. The general preference for life and aversion toward death seems to be the norm in most cultures, especially in the West. But what's so wrong with death, which is not just a natural occurrence, but also a cessation of life's many sufferings? It's the eternal calm, the escape from existence toward the perfect, flawless state of inorganic stillness. It's the return from where we came. Death is usually considered something to be feared, something ill-favored and undesirable. It's the antagonist of the thing most cherished, the state that we wish to maintain and even expand if we get the chance: life. The wish to live seems natural to us and other living beings. We just have to observe our daily efforts to obtain food and water, acquire protection, and, as far as humans are concerned, arrange our circumstances to facilitate our future survival. Not obtaining such things would endanger our lives. In human societies, it's also to be expected that when we're sick, we visit a doctor for a cure. And when we're struck by life-threatening diseases such as cancer, we try to beat these illnesses. Longevity is the holy grail. Early death is a tragedy. Aside from preserving and lengthening life, we generally seek to create it. We pass on our genes and continue our species, a phenomenon any living organism has a propensity for. At some point, the human mind came up with the idea that life is to be cherished. It's a gift and a miracle to be alive, a privilege some attribute to God. But when we look at life honestly, it's difficult to deny the inherent suffering that comes with it. Different thinkers have pointed out this suffering, although they all came to different conclusions regarding solving it. Thousands of years ago, for example, a prince who eventually carried the name Buddha walked the earth and acknowledged that suffering lies at the core of being alive. He presented a solution to the suffering of sentient beings, which would lead to enlightenment, which is the end of suffering and the escape from the cycle of rebirth. Much later, in the 20th century, lived a highly pessimistic Romanian philosopher named Emil Cioran, who experienced life as unbearable, not something to be enjoyed or lived to the fullest, but as a catastrophe to be endured. In his work, The Trouble with Being Born, he criticized the fact humanity, in general, considers birth as the sovereign good and death as the misfortune that comes at the end. But Cioran saw birth as the real evil and death as the mere ending of it. He stated, "If death is as horrible as is claimed, how is it that after the passage of a certain period of time, we consider happy any being, friend or enemy who has ceased to live?" End quote. Now, we can't exclude Arthur Schopenhauer from this essay. This 19th century philosopher claimed that life's suffering far outweighs its pleasures and that we're better off not existing, a claim embraced by the anti-natalist philosopher David Benatar, who explains in his book Better Never to Have Been that coming into existence accompanies serious harm, so much so that it's immoral to give birth to new beings. In his book, Benatar presents a very rational approach toward life and death, carefully comparing the pros and cons of both conditions, leading to his conclusion that it's better not to come into existence. He stated, "We infrequently contemplate the harms that await any newborn child, pain, disappointment, anxiety, grief, and death. for any given child. We cannot predict what form these harms will take or how severe they will be, but we can be sure that at least some of them will occur." End quote. What characterizes these branches of thought is this: a recognition of a significant degree of suffering in life and, more interestingly, a tendency toward non-existence, either through the elusive escape from the cycle of rebirth as a consequence of ascetic practice or through not being born in the first place. According to Schopenhauer, there is a blind, irrational urge to exist and self-sustain despite life's ingrained misery, which he called the will to live, which is extremely difficult to bypass. We can do as we will, but we can't will as we will, according to Schopenhauer, which explains why we tend to live in ways that so obviously generate suffering. Consider our insatiable desires for power, social status, and wealth. When satisfied, the feeling of contentment is only temporary, and we're thrown back into the cycle of desire and discontent rather quickly. Thus, our lives become this perpetual chase of satisfying desire after desire, always leading to another want or need, never bringing lasting fulfillment. So, when we look at life's conditions, isn't there something to be said for the views of Schopenhauer, Benatar, and Cioran? How liberating is it to be bereft of life when the ongoing dissatisfaction with existence fades, as if an unbearable bad movie finally ends? In non-existence, there's nothing to worry about. Minor concerns like choosing what to wear or eat, and more pressing issues such as war, poverty, and illness all come to a halt. If death grants us such relief, isn't it something to look forward to then? Here's where Freud's death drive comes into play, a force that opposes the life drive and entails an unconscious desire to escape life's ongoing suffering. So could it be that the case for non-existence, observed in thinkers like Schopenhauer, Benatar, and Cioran, is not just a product of rational thinking, but also originates from an unconscious force that longs for annihilation? Could it be that besides our conscious attempts to survive and thrive, there's an underlying propensity to return to an inorganic state? Now let's take a closer look at Freud's theory. We've all witnessed in other people, or perhaps even personally experienced, a curious interest in self-destruction. It could be the urge to take copious amounts of intoxicants as a means to tune out, accompanying the risk of poisoning and other potentially long-term health consequences. Or what about the inexplicable desire for self-harm, such as picking at a scab, or engaging in more violent, self-damaging behaviors that cause physical harm? What's the allure of these forms of self-destruction? Could they arise from a mysterious, elusive inner longing for demise? As mentioned, Freud's views on human motivation shifted after he became aware of certain self-destructive tendencies that he couldn't reconcile with his earlier thinking. It became apparent to him that the totality of human pursuits couldn't be traced back to survival and pleasure alone. There seemed to be a more sinister, darker layer to what drives us. Could it be that, besides our inherent will to live, there's also a will to perish? We've explored earlier the allure of non-existence as an argument favoring Freud's death drive. It explained why we might consciously and unconsciously prefer death over life. According to Freud, the death drive is a biological drive in living organisms, also called thanatos, the Greek mythological personification of death, as opposed to eros, referred to as the life force or life drive, which includes self-preservation, reproduction, and creativity. The death drive is an inherent desire to return to the inanimate, an initial state from which the living entity once departed. Freud wrote, "If we are to take it as a truth that knows no exception, that everything living dies for internal reasons, becomes inorganic once again, then we shall be compelled to say that the aim of all life is death, and, looking backwards, that inanimate things existed before living ones." End quote. The death drive is more than simply our journey toward death, which is more of a biological fact, as we all die eventually. The death drive is an active force. Aside from our imminent journey from the cradle to the grave, it's an unconscious longing for demise, or, as we could say, the wish for this journey to end sooner than biologically determined. It's the tension that arose by departing from nothingness that tries to cancel itself out, a drive to return to where it came from. So we could look at Icarus' actions not as bravery or youthful recklessness, but as a manifestation of the unconscious death drive to escape from the domain of tension into nothingness. Life inspires more dread than death. It is life which is the great unknown, wrote Cioran, to which we could say that death is the great known, the state that's plain as day, as there's nothing there, nothing to attain, nothing to run from, nothing to endure, nothing to worry about, which makes this great nothing so liberating. But Freud's death drive and manifestations within human behavior are more complex than a blunt desire for non-existence, even though this drive could manifest as an explicit death wish nonetheless. The death drive also expresses itself in other behaviors which caught Freud's interest. Such behaviors are irrational forms of destructiveness rather than direct attempts to escape life. An example of such behavior is the concept of repetition compulsion. Freud saw that his patients often repeated self-destructive patterns or traumatic scenes, even when aware of this behavior. Personally, I tend to listen to music occasionally that evokes traumatic past experiences, including emotions such as sadness and melancholy. These are usually pieces of music I listened to during the times I had these experiences. Bringing back all these memories doesn't make sense. They're hurtful and don't contribute to my happiness and well-being. It's something I would be better off not doing, in the same way I would better not put my hand on a stove. Yet, there's something strangely satisfying about it. In this case, it's a tendency to seek pain instead of pleasure, which Freud saw as a subtle manifestation of the death drive. Such endeavor comes across as conflicting within the notion that the death drive seeks relief from life's tension, as it, through repetition compulsion, maintains and even increases the tension. These contradictions make this concept so difficult to grasp and probably contribute to the fact that Freud's death drive is one of his work's most controversial and debated concepts. Freud also believed that the death drive doesn't purely direct itself inward, it also projects itself outward in the form of aggression toward others. According to Freud, aggressive behavior comes from a desire to destroy outside of the self. The phenomenon of sadism is an expression of the death drive as well, as opposed to masochism, which refers to a desire for pain and self-destruction. As we have explored in the previous chapter, within the wish for non-existence hides a more profound longing for relief. Peace, essentially. A curious expression of such longing, one that I've had plenty of experience with, is substance abuse. Why would someone drink himself into a coma? Why would people inject poisonous substances into their bodies? When we think of it, it's absurd. From the perspective of the death drive, this behavior is merely another manifestation of the unconscious longing to revert to the inanimate, given that the primary appeal of these substances is their ability to help one escape from reality. Freud's controversial concept received much criticism, and many psychoanalysts rejected it. Critics stated that there wasn't enough empirical evidence to prove the existence of such a drive. Also, other theories could explain self-destructive tendencies or outward aggressiveness, such as attachment theory, behaviorism, and cognitive theories. Cultural and societal factors may also influence how we view self-destruction and outward hostility. Still, there have been thinkers who further developed Freud's death drive, such as Jacques Lacan and Slavoj Žižek. Lacan, for example, rejected Freud's notion that the death drive is biological. Lacan saw it as a fundamental aspect of the symbolic order, the realm of symbols, language, and social norms that shape our reality. So according to Lacan, the death drive takes place more on the level of thought than biology. Žižek sees the death drive similarly, but expanded this idea, including a focus on the role of society, consumerism specifically, arousing the death drive. The death drive remains a topic of discussion. The concept challenges us to confront our self-destructive tendencies and the irrationality that often hides behind them. Are these behaviors random or products of conditioning or trauma? Or could there indeed be a force at play that longs for self-destruction or even death? I was also thinking about the topic of loneliness and social isolation in the light of the death drive. Could the tendency to isolate oneself from others also be a manifestation of it? What do you think? Please let us know in the comment section. Thank you for watching. When someone spends more time in solitude than is considered normal, then people begin to worry. What's going on with this person? Is he doing okay? Is she depressed? And so we tell them to get out there, meet people and connect. Humans are social animals, they say. Or, whatever you do, don't isolate yourself. Isolating yourself is bad for you. But often, reasonings like these seem to fall on deaf ears. The individual in question does not want to socialize and isn't interested in a relationship or making friends. This person just wants to be left alone. Self-imposed social isolation is a complex issue. I know it's complex because I've experienced it myself, and to be honest, I'm still experiencing it to a certain degree. You see, in my view, social isolation isn't always imposed. In many cases, it's also a deliberate choice. It's an escape from the downsides of engaging with others. It's the condition of being tuned out, of having thrown the towel in the ring, of having decided not to play, at least for a while. I'll admit, without hesitation, that such an attitude isn't always healthy. While self-imposed social isolation is a retreat in the safe confines of one's private space, it also denies social interactions with other people. It's a disentanglement from public life, a refuge in one's mind and individual microcosm. It could leave one prone to psychological problems, resentment, warped views of what's out there, and hateful echo chambers on the internet. Still, I believe that social isolation is understandable. It's not just a byproduct of the zeitgeist, but also a symptom of what it means to be human. So why do many people choose to be alone and isolated? What are their motivations? And is there a solution to this phenomenon? This video explores social isolation and why being alone isn't always by accident. It's often a choice. Social isolation and loneliness are not synonymous. One can be socially isolated, but not lonely, living happily in one's own company. But one can also be among the crowds, have many friends and other social connections, and be lonely. That said, it's prevalent for someone socially isolated to feel lonely due to the lack of social interaction. We could also state that social isolation is an objective situation, although in many forms and degrees, while loneliness is a subjective experience. Hence, some socially isolated people rarely feel loneliness, while others do. But that doesn't mean that the socially isolated people who don't experience loneliness are without problems. They could have underlying issues that facilitate their tendency to stay away from people. For example, there's a mental condition named schizoid personality disorder, which characterizes itself as not needing social interaction and a preference for solitude. But people suffering from this condition also lack joy and pleasure. I've experienced several more prolonged periods of what I would call semi-social isolation. I say semi because I was never wholly excluded from social interactions. Complete social isolation is a rarity in the digital age, as we can easily interact with people on the internet, regardless of how superficial these interactions are, and that they happen digitally and not in real life. So when I speak of social isolation in this video, I'll mainly refer to semi-social isolation. Also, I've always had a couple of friends in the background and my 4 siblings, mother, stepfather and other family members. However, there have been times when my interactions with these people were very minimal while living alone in my apartment. I wasn't particularly interested in connecting with online strangers either. Periods without seeing people became longer once I stopped working a regular job and began creating content full-time somewhere in 2019. And when the pestilence hit in 2020, I experienced weeks without seeing a single soul. When I look back on these times, I'll admit that I eventually felt lonely and cut off from others. But I wasn't always bothered by it. As everything has turned normal, I even miss those times of government-enforced isolation. Despite the moments of loneliness, it also provided this unprecedented solace, a temporary liberation from the world. I already had some relief after I quote-unquote escaped office life, but enforced isolation brought this relief to another level, as it freed me from social obligations such as attending parties I didn't want to attend. The virus was a perfect excuse to avoid people altogether. Cancelled weddings and birthday parties, although very sad for the people concerned, quite honestly was like music to my ears. However, there were also days I craved social interaction as feelings of loneliness crept up on me. Desire and aversion, I know. I can only imagine what Epictetus would have said had I attended his lectures, but I guess I'm human. I'm still conflicted about those times and to what degree they were beneficial to me and to what extent they were harmful. However, they taught me that social isolation is a response to a double bind. On the one hand, it affects people's inherent inclination towards social interaction. On the other hand, it relieves people from the same thing they're inclined to. I craved what I enjoyed not doing simultaneously, which was connecting with people. In addition, I felt this weird silent solidarity with the rest of the world. Suddenly, I wasn't the only one spending the majority of time in solitude. Through the measures imposed by the government, I now had many companions. I realized that being alone is more enjoyable when many others have a similar fate. Nevertheless, I've experienced what it's like to have minimal interaction with people and what it did to my thoughts and perceptions of the world and to my emotional states, which wasn't always positive. But I've also tasted the pleasantness of not putting up with people for a prolonged time, and the joy and peace I found during the lockdown baffled me. People generally hated it, but I wouldn't have minded if it lasted a few years longer. So I thought to myself, what's wrong with me? The 18th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer might have the answer to my question. He described the nature of human relationships as a dilemma and explained it using hedgehogs. Imagine a group of hedgehogs in the snowy winter with 2 choices to deal with the cold. The first option is to draw close, seeking mutual warmth in each other's embrace. However, when they do, they also hurt one another with their sharp spikes. Hence, many of the hedgehogs choose the second option, which is to endure the cold alone. Schopenhauer's hedgehog dilemma effectively shows the predicament of human relations, the double bind I mentioned before. On the one hand, we crave social interaction. On the other hand, social interaction is a source of hurt. It's probably the dominant source of trauma. And for some people, this dark side of social interaction outweighs its benefits. These people tend to retreat from social life. They prefer the coldness of aloneness over the pain that comes with spending time around people. So how does this dilemma relate to me? And how does it provide an answer to my question? I realized that Schopenhauer's simile explained what I've been grappling with my entire adult life. When I'm honest with myself, my tendency to seek solitude isn't just the mere preference for being alone. It's also because the spikes, so to speak, have been hurtful too often in the past, which has been influencing my decisions throughout my adult life. You see, even though I'm quite introverted by nature and always fared reasonably well in solitude, I used to be a social and outgoing guy in the past as well, although very often intoxicants were involved, and now not so much anymore. undoubtedly getting older and the changing stages of life are factors in this. But unfortunately, these aren't the only reasons, and I'm far from alone when it comes to a strong tendency to seek solitude due to hurtful past experiences with people. Quite recently, while staying in Asia for a couple of months, I read Bukowski's books, Post Office and Ham on Rye, which are semi-autobiographical novels that revolve around the main character Henry Chinesky. Chinesky often feels at odds with the world around him. He experiences a deep sense of alienation, partly because of the mundane nature of his job and his nonconformism, but also because he is not accepted and ostracized by his environment. He is a stereotypical lone wolf. He seeks solace in alcohol as well to ease his past trauma, but also as a social lubricant, to which I can personally relate strongly. Bukowski is known to be a solitary figure who preferred the company of a few close friends or spending time alone, reading and writing. When asked if he hated people, he answered, "I don't hate them, I just feel better when they're not around." Aside from trauma and social exclusion, there are more factors leading to people preferring solitude. We can see a curious example of this in Japan, a country dealing with a growing population, predominantly men who turn their backs on society and spend their lives in isolation. These people are called hikikomori, which translates to social withdrawal. Having stayed in Japan for nearly 2 months not too long ago, I can imagine why Japanese people would be prone to social isolation. In my experience, Japan is a utopic place. It's incredibly safe, very structured, beautiful and well organized, and everything there seems to move in a near perfect harmony, from people on the streets to public transport. But at the same time, I've experienced the Japanese as very hierarchical and challenging to connect with, which could be partly because of the language barrier. And there seems to be a lot of social pressure on these people. Society expects them to participate fully by climbing the career ladder and starting families, and the opportunities to make it in Japan are rigid. Generally, Japanese people have to ensure they're employed right after higher education and often work for the same employer for the rest of their lives. Working life is harsh and intense in Japan. People work long hours and companies expect immense loyalty and sacrifice. So what does this have to do with social isolation? We can roughly divide the hikikomori into 2 groups. The first group missed their opportunity during Japan's so-called lost decade, a time of economic downfall. These members of the so-called lost generation failed to meet societal expectations and therefore retreated into social isolation, partly out of shame. The second and emerging group belongs to the younger generations. Although they have a shot to conform to societal standards, they choose to walk away from society as they don't want to deal with its vast demands and just want to stay away from all the bullshit. Although their motivations are probably complex and differ per individual. Most hikikomori live with their parents, while others are self-employed and can afford to live independently. They hardly or never leave their houses, and their social life is non-existent. As human hermits, they hide not so much from the world itself, but from the people in it. Looking at the long tradition of hermits during humanity, such as the ancient desert fathers and Taoist sages, it seems that aloneness as a mode of living isn't all too alien to being human. Some of us, against our supposed need for companionship, seem to fare well and even better in solitude. Even the ancient Stoics, who were cosmopolitans and valued participation in public life, recognized the experience of being alone as a natural element of being human. Epictetus stated, "But one ought, nonetheless, to prepare oneself for this also, that is, to be able to be self-sufficient, to be able to commune with oneself, even as Zeus communes with himself, and is at peace with himself, and contemplates the character of his governance, and occupies himself with ideas appropriate to himself. So ought we also be able to converse with ourselves, not to be in need of others, not to be at a loss for some way to spend our time." My moments in solitude weren't always pleasurable. I've experienced loneliness and some symptoms of depression in the past. And amid the pestilence, the absence of people around me, not seeing a single soul for weeks truly started to bother me. Nope, I'm not a sage, after all. I too need social interaction, although it may be less than usual. In this ocean of solitude, I was alone with myself in an unprecedented way. And even though I managed, it turned out that myself wasn't always good company. In solitude, one becomes prone to damaging and excessive thinking. Often, conversations with oneself become more prevalent, and the absence of people to share one's thoughts with results in bottling up those thoughts. And in worst cases, they grow into an analytical tumor, tormenting one's mind. We often underestimate the presence of another, someone who listens and can transform and debunk our cognitive distortions and destructive musings. Someone telling us that the world is not as terrible as we believe it is, or that our thinking stems from personal biases instead of factual information. Other people lighten us up and refresh the pages of our minds. During the long stretches of aloneness, I even started to miss my old job and my former co-workers, and I wouldn't have minded attending a boring meeting if that meant some social interaction. Sometimes I would look back with nostalgia on workspace conversations, the jokes, the smiles, almost forgetting its less enjoyable facets. Unexpectedly, at least to me, I felt nostalgia for what I had escaped. So I realized that although I don't regret my choice of working alone instead of among people, being too desolate wasn't great either. At least not to me. The risks of social isolation are well documented. Extensive research links social isolation to depression and anxiety, increased stress, and lower self-esteem. There are also physical health risks such as a weakened immune system, increased inflammation, and sleep issues. But the extent of these issues depends on one's personality. Some fare well in solitude, others can't stand being alone. At the extreme end, from a societal point of view, we have hermits who choose isolation, are self-sufficient, and find great peace and contentment in solitude. In many cases, these individuals have adopted a spiritual or philosophical belief system that gives meaning to their lifestyle. For example, a Christian hermit who spends most of his time in prayer experiences a deep sense of connection with God, which is so fulfilling and meaningful that it renders the need for mundane social interaction obsolete. But for most people, such a lifestyle probably isn't ideal or desired. Yet many of these people still seek solitude for various reasons and need social interaction. Is there a solution for them? From my experience, exploring the motivations why I seek solitude so much has been helpful. For me, these motivations are multifaceted. Solitude allows me to do creative work and introspection, for example, which I regard as positive. But could there be negative, fear-based reasons, such as hiding from people, social anxiety, shame, guilt, and painful past experiences? I would be lying if I said I only have positive motivations. Unfortunately, I don't. Schopenhauer had an idea to tackle his hedgehog dilemma, as he sought to socialize in a way that minimizes both the cold and the painful spikes. What he came up with is interesting. He proposed that to avoid the pain of human interaction and the loneliness of social isolation, we should engage in politeness and good manners, which allows us to interact with people but keep them at a distance. Of course, as Schopenhauer admitted, this approach has one big problem. The need for mutual warmth will not be adequately satisfied. So, what's left? Should we take the risk of getting hurt? Or being stuck with people that suck the life out of us? Of being overwhelmed by too much chatter that doesn't amount to anything? Or worse, of being bullied and abused? Well, what helped me was being selective and creative. As far as possible, I became more selective in my interactions and the people I spent time with, and tried to spend more time in good company. I also examined possibilities for social interaction, such as travel. In fact, after the summer of 22, when the pestilence was as good as gone and international travel was possible again without too much hassle, I hopped on a high-speed train and, a week later, on a plane. After almost 3 years of solitude, I returned to the world. a refreshing journey of exploration, working in coffee shops and connecting with local people. Spending time out there and meeting people was good. The joy of it I had forgotten, so it seemed. Even though social interactions generally deplete my energy, they also rejuvenate me. Often, but not always, things start to flow again, mentally and physically, after a period of emotional and cognitive constipation. One of the benefits of my work as a content creator is that no location chains me. So why not use this feature to get social interaction in ways I like? But not anyone has the possibility to travel. What helps me at home is working in places like libraries and coffee shops and using the internet for social interaction with friends through occasional online gaming. The latter is not a full substitute for real-life interactions, but does involve social interaction. So, is there a solution to social isolation? There are plenty, and the most straightforward approach is just to get out there and meet people. But social isolation is a complex issue. There are many reasons why people avoid social interaction and spend the majority of their lives in solitude. There is probably no one-size-fits-all solution, as every case of chronic solitude is unique. Every loner has a different story. Some crave social interaction, but their trauma and anxiety hold them back. For others, minimal social interaction suffices, and Schopenhauer's advice isn't such a bad idea for them. Without question, there are many shades of grey in between. As with everything, one's need for both solitude and social interaction changes over time. It's not entirely clear where I fall on the loner spectrum right now. I could need more interaction than I believe, or maybe not. Anyway, I hope this video resonates. So, what's your story? Do you spend much time alone? And why is that? Let us know in the comment section. Thank you for watching.
In the summer of 2014, the world was in a festive mood as yet another World Cup was about to head underway. But on Wednesday, June 11th, the city of Sao Paulo, one of the main hosts of the World Cup, was anything but festive. Entire parts of the city remained shut, as cars were stuck on stretches of tarmac as far as the eye could see. The effects soon extended well beyond the city, as the entire country of Brazil felt the effects of what would become the worst traffic jam in history. Eventually, the jam was said to have been over 214 miles long. Disputes about the economic implications of hosting a World Cup, worker deaths, and countrywide protests were ultimately what led to it. But Sao Paulo is notorious for being one of the most congested places in the entire planet. Now, you and I may not have been in such a historic traffic jam, but we've definitely had our experiences of being stuck in traffic. When the cars barely seem to move, the lights barely seem to change, and before you know it, a little 5-mile drive ended up taking you over 2 hours. Aside from driving us completely out of our minds, these traffic jams have obvious implications, economic and otherwise. Just in 2018 alone, traffic congestion is said to have cost the US economy around $87 billion. In addition, congestion increases fuel consumption, and by extension, emissions. In reality, this just hurts us more than it helps. It wastes precious time that we could have spent just being where we wanted to be. Instances of road rage rise, which then contributes to more driver error, which means more accidents, which means more traffic. It sucks. Traffic is much more demanding on our body, mind, and deteriorates the quality of life of everyone involved. You either go to the office to angry bosses or home to a cold dinner. Which really begs the question, how far off are we to solving this terrible, terrible thing? Well, let's get to that. What makes traffic jams and congestion so interesting is that, beyond the more quantifiable metrics such as the flow of cars, the volume of traffic, number of lanes, and so on, there's this other spontaneous factor to this phenomenon that's much more harder to predict or measure. The human factor. Each vehicle is, after all, being maneuvered or piloted by a human driver. at least for now anyway. And as such, the intricacies of traffic are, in a way, just expressions of the intricacies of human behavior. It all defaults back to us, the driver. It's no wonder then that Tom Vanderbilt, a guy who literally wrote an entire book talking about traffic, calls New York City traffic a giant applied psych lab. Let's see why he would say that. He refers to an experiment conducted in England by a traffic psychologist named Ian Walker, where bicycles are rigged with sensors that would calculate the distance and speed of vehicles driving past. The experimental conditions were as such. In the first scenario, the rider was wearing a helmet. In the second, he wasn't. And in the third, he tried to appear female by wearing a wig and a dress. It was found that, when the rider appeared to be wearing a helmet, the cars felt more comfortable driving close by. When he wasn't wearing a helmet, they gave him a bit more space. And when the rider seemed to be a woman, they gave him even more space. These are judgments, which Tom likes to call beneath the subconscious, that the drivers were making about the competence of the rider, and the likelihood of an accident with very little and often inaccurate evidence. Ask yourself, are riders wearing helmets always more experienced? Does wearing a helmet make you safer? Physically, yes, but mentally, it could cause you to act differently, and take risky maneuvers that you otherwise might not have. There are other experiments like this, of course. You might think that the more regulated a traffic is, the safer it is. The more often you see signals and signs at intersections, the more careful they will be. But that's not the case as it turns out. If there's too many signals, drivers often find themselves in a false sense of security. The seemingly abundance of caution that the traffic lights can portray causes drivers to drop their guard in the most risky parts of the road, which often leads to more accidents. This seemingly unintuitive idea was actually discovered due to an electrical failure in a traffic light. And the observation, and the later theory that emerged from it, is credited to Dutch traffic engineer Hans Motorman. He developed the idea of shared space when driving. Essentially, instead of adding more signs, street markings, crosswalks, and so on, you instead actually remove these things, the very things you think were actually making you safe. There are no curbs separating the street from the sidewalk. There aren't sidewalks to begin with, it's just all together, cars and pedestrians. With this, drivers find themselves less confident than they were before, because, well, there's no separation. There's nothing splitting those driving cars and those who are just on bikes or even walking. It makes drivers more cautious, which in turn actually saves more lives by preventing accidents in traffic as opposed to increasing it. Of course, there are more intuitive instances of traffic behavior, namely things like rubbernecking. It's when an accident in one lane of traffic causes drivers in other lanes, or even other roads, to slow down while they're passing by to watch things as they unfold, because we're nosy and like to get into other people's business. But beyond the physical obstruction that the accident causes, this is an added slowdown often caused purely by psychological reasons. If just a few cars slow down from this, other cars behind them are forced to slow down. The ripple effect leads to more widespread congestion, and before you know it, you're in bumper-to-bumper traffic. That's exactly why in some countries, accident sites are quickly covered with portable boundaries to prevent people from catching an unnecessary glance. But here again, the human factor creeps in. Tom suggests that there might be more to this mundane activity. He thinks that drivers sometimes pause not to just see what's going on, but also to reflect briefly on their own morality, the possibility of something like this happening to them as well. Everyone thinks they're a good driver, until they aren't. Another curious aspect of traffic is the non-linearity between the amount of traffic and the congestion that it leads to. What I mean is, if only 1% of all drivers were to use public transportation, that could lead to a reduction in traffic by more than 20%. Although not a bottleneck in the traditional sense, the convention of 9 to 5 office hours might have a lot to do with congestion as well. In normal circumstances, in daily routine, traffic tends to form at similar times because everyone is on similar schedules. Everyone heading to work at roughly the same time has been notoriously bad for economies. With the recent pandemic and the wave of companies trying to get their work done online, you have to wonder what the long-term implications of this newfound flexibility will be on traffic. While most offices will still be operated from physical spaces, even a slight reduction in the daily number of commuters could have a drastic effect on congestion, and improve economies while doing so. And while the long-term changes might be positive for the most part, it doesn't mean everything is perfect. Some studies have emerged stating that, while there were indeed fewer accidents by volume, a higher percentage of them were fatal. Drivers were again guilty of feeling safer, and were thereby less alert, on emptier roads, which led to more speeding. The psychological implications of feeling safe on the road can cause a chain reaction of decisions that ultimately make you less safe, which is another remarkable stat that doesn't make sense on first glance. Sometimes, the bottlenecks are even more obvious. For example, roads that are not wide enough to accommodate necessary volumes, unplanned infrastructure, or as in the case of Sao Paulo, a massive countrywide protest. These are some of the biggest causes of congestion on our roads today. If we were somehow able to control these issues, however, would that mean the eradication of traffic forever? Well, if only things were that simple. In one of the more remarkable experiments by some Japanese physicists, you can see cars traveling in a circle, completely devoid of any of the traditional bottlenecks. All they have to do is turn left. That's literally it. They are driving in a closed circular track, no intersections, no distractions. They are also asked to maintain a steady speed and a steady distance, traditional traffic advice. So it's not like the experiment is rigged to cause the drivers to make a mistake. In fact, they're just asking them to drive normally. And sure enough, they start just fine. But after the experiment runs for a brief period, as time passes on, the human factor steps in. Some of the drivers have difficulty maintaining a steady speed or distance. They are either too close to the vehicle in front or the one behind. To correct this, they have to brake or accelerate. As with most human drivers, they end up overcompensating. After all, better safe than sorry, right? Now, this causes the driver behind this car to stop as well, and the results of all these reactions are further compounded by the reaction times of each of the other drivers. A sudden braking in front of a driver causes him to brake, and that causes the driver behind him to brake as well. Erratic braking emerges out of nowhere, and with it emerges a congested flow of traffic. Before you know it, you're stuck in traffic where there shouldn't be. Traffic that came out of nowhere. This is what is called a phantom traffic jam. Out of nothing physical whatsoever, a traffic jam self-generates using only our reaction times, and often, it dissipates as organically as it emerges. Besides, you have to consider the fact that if even the most controlled simulations can lead to such a traffic jam, then the chaos of the real world only adds fuel to the fire. Real roads are not single-lane, closed-off circular tracks. They are mazes of tarmac, driven on by drivers that are using their phones, drivers that are in a hurry, drivers that are barely rested, drivers that probably shouldn't be driving. Theoretically, the ripple effect of traffic jams could still be absorbed by maintaining a long enough gap between vehicles. The more space you have between you and the car ahead of you, the more time you and the cars behind you have to react in time to brake smoothly and still keep going. It can be difficult to accept that the phantom traffic jams seemingly arise out of nothing, especially given the overall impact of traffic jams on the economy, our well-being, and the rest of the world. Which brings us to traffic forecasting. If you aren't able to prevent traffic, maybe being aware of when it may occur is the next best thing? Right now, most of us use Google Maps to estimate traffic in a particular region. If you've ever used your phone as a GPS, you'll see areas that show up red as congested areas begin to form. Google uses Android phones to crowdsource data about numerous things like the number of vehicles in a region and how fast they're moving. And if you've ever used an Android phone yourself, you've contributed to the pool of data too. But it's still not necessarily forecasting a jam. It's merely telling you if one has already been formed, which is certainly useful, but not a solution. Newer methods of forecasting are being developed with the use of machine learning and AI. Cameras mounted on signals and busy intersections are feeding data to a control center that is then regulating traffic signals across a given region. This is allowing for two things. 1. To be able to predict traffic with as much as 90% accuracy. And 2. To be able to react to emerging congestions by temporarily closing off certain roads and opening others. It's being tested in one of the most congested regions in the world, India. But the tests are still on a smaller scale. These systems are yet to see large-scale implementation. But there is a possibility that these forecasting systems will become obsolete before they're even rolled out. That's because of the emergence of self-driving cars. Think about it. What is at the core of some of the most unavoidable traffic jams? The human factor. It is the inability of human drivers to maintain a steady speed and distance, and self-driving cars can take that element right out of the equation. Aside from being able to better prevent fatal accidents, I think another major aspect of how self-driving cars will change our roads for the better is by preventing congestion. If cars can communicate amongst themselves, lanes could be merged automatically. Blind spots would no longer be a thing if you have 360-degree cameras on the car. We could even get rid of signals and traffic lights since the cars would just communicate amongst themselves about when to stop and when to go. That would reduce a lot of the clutter in our cityscapes. But what about the cars that are still driven by us humans? The thing is, the transition to 100% self-driving cars could be an extremely difficult one if we're not careful. We still have to factor in that in the near future, the roads will not be the automated utopia that we're dreaming of. Rather, they'll be a bit of both, human-driven cars and self-driven cars, each adapting to one another. If we're so busy building our infrastructure with driverless cars, we could forget about the very people that are supposed to be benefiting from it. After all, a self-driving car's job will not only be to drive itself and communicate with other self-driving cars, but to also adapt to the unpredictability of a human driver, however many of them are still remaining. Transportation has always been tied to civilization. Our ability to cooperate in large numbers, which is what led to the rise and sustenance of our civilization, has a lot to do with the ability to cover large distances sustainably. A large portion of that distance has been covered on roads. In fact, getting from A to B has a remarkable effect on our perception of the world and the decisions we take. Aside from the obvious economic implications traffic has, it also makes the world seem like a larger place than it needs to be. People spend a disproportionate amount of valuable time out on the roads, time that you'll never get back. They also don't meet each other as often, and a lot of the world's wonders that surround us remain untouched, unexplored. Making sure that we explore them involves understanding traffic jams, and by extension, the minds of the humans that cause them. Why do we dream? This is one of life's great unanswered questions. Given that we spend around 6 years of our lives in a dream state, it's no wonder people want to understand why we do it. Sure, there are theories, and I'll get to them, but there's no clear consensus on why we do it. No one really knows for sure. Or do they? Dreams are strange, to say the least, and for many of us, they hold great significance. So much that we like to share them with others at length, if we can even remember them, and try to interpret their secret and hidden meanings. So, do they actually hold any real meaning? Well, I have some ideas. Before we get to some of the bigger questions, let's just look at what goes on inside the brain as our nighttime adventures take their course. While sleeping, we go through different cycles of the 5 stages of sleep. These are divided into REM sleep and non-REM sleep. REM simply means rapid eye movement. It explains itself, right? The first 4 stages are non-REM sleep. These are restorative and, for the most part, dreamless. As we move through these initial stages, our brain activity slows. But about 90 minutes after we finally fall asleep, we hit stage 5, REM sleep. This is when the dreaming really gets going. When we're in this stage, the body is, for all intents and purposes, paralyzed. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure rises, and brain activity returns to near waking levels. The paralysis in REM sleep is caused by the release of glycine, an amino acid from the brainstem, onto your brain's motor neurons. It's suggested that this paralysis is nature's way of preventing us from acting on our dreams, and that's probably for the best. The limbic system is a pretty primitive part of the brain that deals with emotions, and is very active during REM sleep. It's made up of the amygdala, which is mostly associated with fear, the hippocampus, which is heavily involved in the formation of long-term memory, and the cingulate gyrus, which is involved in our physical reactions to situations. Break down the roles of these bizarre brain structures, and we can start to paint a picture of why our dreams often take the bizarre and scary forms they do. Couple this with the fact that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that deals with logic and self-control, isn't really active during REM sleep, and things might just start to make sense. But understanding it isn't enough to prevent these nightmares from happening. It can also happen while you're awake. Sleep paralysis is a terrifying concept. Like I just mentioned, when you fall asleep, your brain doesn't completely shut off. In order to prevent you from acting out your dreams while you sleep, the brain releases chemicals that leave you paralyzed. This paralysis is supposed to be lifted as soon as you wake up. But sometimes, it doesn't. And that's where you get sleep paralysis. You wake up, you're aware of your consciousness, but you can't move. It feels as if there's a massive weight on your body preventing you from actually waking up. Sleep paralysis is often most caused by disrupted REM sleep, so some people may believe they're still dreaming when they're in fact awake. Because of this, some of your nightmares could leak into the real world. While undergoing sleep paralysis, you'll often see things standing in the corners of your room, or on the ceiling, or even closer. Luckily, this usually goes away pretty quickly. So, is it just biology? Is that really the answer? Is there no secret window into our psyche? Everyone, at one time or another, has wondered what their dreams mean. Some believe that dreams have no meaning and serve no function, others believe that they're one of the most important things that human biology has allowed to happen. There's in fact many theories of why we dream and what purpose it serves. I can't really go any further without mentioning Freud. His theories of dreams are probably the most well-known in the world. It focuses on the content of the dreams themselves as an explanation of the function of dreaming. German psychiatrist Sigmund Freud theorized that dreams represented a window into the unconscious mind, a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories that are beyond our conscious awareness. The bulk of the iceberg is submerged deep underwater. Most of the contents of the unconscious mind are supposedly unacceptable or unpleasant, representing feelings of pain, anxiety, or conflict. When we're sleeping, the forces that keep these